All right, so you guys sent us some pretty heavy stuff for this deep dive. We're going to be looking into some serious allegations against American Airlines.
Yeah.
Claims of racial profiling and discrimination
Hmm.
based on a number of lawsuits.
Yeah, these cases are really concerning because they don't seem like just isolated incidents. They seem to point to a pattern of behavior
Yeah.
and really raise questions about systemic bias within the entire airline industry.
Yeah, and our main source for this deep dive is an episode of the legal show Sidebar.
Okay.
It's hosted by Jesse Weber on Law and Crime.
Mm-hmm.
And in this episode, he interviews a civil rights attorney named Jasmine Rand.
Okay.
And she represents several clients who are currently suing American Airlines.
Interesting.
And get this, one of the cases that she talks about is a honeymooning couple who are accused of human trafficking.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, talk about starting your honeymoon off on a bad note.
Yeah, it really is. And this case is a perfect example of how implicit bias can have these really devastating consequences.
Okay.
Implicit bias is basically like the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that we have about different groups of people.
Okay.
And these biases can actually impact how we see things and how we act, even when we're not aware of them.
Right.
Like you see a group of teenagers in hoodies.
Yeah.
And you immediately get nervous, even though they haven't done anything wrong.
Right.
That could be driven by implicit bias.
So how does that play into the honeymoon case?
So in this case, back in September of 2022,
Okay.
you have Anthony Williams, who's a retired black officer,
Yeah.
and his wife, Katerina Shishula,
Okay.
who is a white woman from Russia.
Okay.
They were flying from Phoenix to Miami for their honeymoon.
Makes sense.
And during the flight, another passenger reported them to the airline staff,
For suspecting
human trafficking.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Just because they were a mixed race couple.
That's crazy.
I mean, talk about
Starting your honeymoon
not a good start to a honeymoon.
off on the wrong foot. It's just unbelievable.
And this really points to this troubling statistic that we see. Studies have shown that black passengers are way more likely to be scrutinized or reported for suspicious behavior
Right.
compared to their white counterparts.
It's really unfair.
And the lawsuit claims that in this case, the airline staff didn't even really investigate
Really?
before they involved law enforcement,
Oh, wow.
which just made the whole situation worse.
Yeah. That's so unnecessary.
It really is.
And to make matters even worse, the lawsuit actually includes a picture of this couple on the plane,
Oh, wow.
happily enjoying their honeymoon,
Okay.
I mean, it's just mind-blowing that someone would accuse them of something so serious
Yeah.
based on what prompted this passenger to go to such extremes?
It makes you wonder if it was based on racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
And how those can really affect people's judgment.
The fact that this couple kind of fit a certain profile in the mind of this accusing passenger.
Right.
A black man with a younger white woman.
Yeah.
It seems like that really played a role in how this situation escalated.
This Jasmine Rand, the attorney representing the couple, she seems to be a real powerhouse when it comes to fighting racial discrimination. She specializes in civil rights law, and she doesn't just represent the honeymooners, though, right?
No, she's actually representing a number of other clients who are also suing American Airlines.
Okay, and all of these cases seem to show similar patterns of racial profiling.
Exactly.
Can you give us some examples of some of the other cases?
So there's one case involving David Ryan Harris.
Okay.
He's a musician. He's actually toured with John Mayer.
Oh, wow.
And he was accused of trafficking his own biracial children.
No way, his own children.
Yeah, it's
insane.
It really shows you how deeply ingrained these racial biases can be.
Yeah.
And how they can lead to just these really absurd and hurtful accusations.
What other cases stand out to you?
Well, there's another case with 3 black men who were taken off of a flight.
Okay.
For no real reason.
What?
They didn't even know each other.
Seriously?
Yeah.
It wasn't even like they were traveling together.
No, not at all.
Or someone thought they looked suspicious as a group.
Nope.
They were just individual black passengers who happened to be on the same flight.
Exactly. And this case really supports the idea that there might be a systemic problem with the airline.
Yeah.
If multiple black passengers who don't know each other
Right.
are all reporting these same kinds of experiences of discrimination,
Right.
it seems like it's more than just a few random incidents.
It's like there's this underlying assumption that Black passengers are somehow automatically more suspicious
Right.
or more likely to cause problems.
Which is just outrageous.
It's a dangerous assumption to make.
Yeah.
Because it keeps these harmful stereotypes alive.
Right.
And it makes it easier for racial profiling to happen. Absolutely. And then there's the case of Pamela Hill, who's a 70-year-old retired Black judge.
Oh, wow.
Who was accused of slamming a bathroom door.
Okay.
And get this, she was then told to use the restroom at the back of the plane.
Really?
Even though white male passengers were using the same bathroom without any issue.
It makes you wonder why she was singled out.
Right, like was it just because she was a Black woman?
Exactly. And that's why these lawsuits are so important.
Yeah.
They force us to look at these uncomfortable truths, and they demand accountability for these potentially discriminatory practices.
So how has American Airlines responded to all this? I mean, have they addressed these allegations head on?
Well, according to the Sidebar episode, their response has been kind of lukewarm so far.
Okay.
They did issue a statement to the media emphasizing their commitment to, providing a positive experience for all passengers.
Okay.
And they said they're reviewing the lawsuit allegations.
Sounds like a pretty standard response, right?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Jasmine Rand says that American Airlines hasn't actually reached out to her or her clients directly.
So they're saying one thing publicly, but they're not actually taking any concrete steps to address the issue.
Yeah, it makes you question how committed they really are to fixing this.
Rand is very critical of the airline's response.
She is.
She says that American Airlines needs better training for their employees.
Yeah.
So that they can recognize and address racial bias when they're interacting with passengers.
That's a good point.
Do you think she's right?
It's complicated.
Okay.
Individual prejudice might definitely exist among some employees.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that these individual biases can be made worse by the company's culture and structure.
Yeah.
If the company itself isn't doing anything to address them.
So you're saying that even if every single employee at American Airlines had the best intentions, there could still be a problem if the company itself doesn't actively work to combat racial bias.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's like, imagine a workplace where it's okay to make sexist jokes.
Right.
Even if most people find them offensive,
Yeah.
a few people might keep making those jokes.
Right.
And that creates a hostile work environment.
It normalizes it. Yeah.
It's the same idea here.
Okay.
If there aren't clear policies or procedures or training programs in place, individual biases can turn into discriminatory actions.
Yeah.
Even if it's unintentional.
So it's not just about getting rid of the so-called bad apples.
Nope.
It's about changing the whole barrel.
Exactly.
Creating a culture of accountability and equity from the top down.
And this brings us to the heart of the issue. Systemic racism.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual prejudice. It's about how those biases get embedded into institutions and systems.
Right.
And that creates unequal outcomes for different racial groups.
And if we're talking about systems with a history of racial discrimination, I mean, the airline industry definitely fits the bill.
It does.
So if American Airlines really wants to address these issues, they can't just respond to individual complaints.
Right.
They need to actually take a hard look at their policies and procedures to figure out what's causing these problems, even if it's unintentionally.
It's about identifying and dismantling any practices that might be perpetuating this racial bias.
So we're talking about their hiring practices, their promotion criteria, the way they handle customer service. I mean, everything.
Everything. And a really important part of that is, are they holding employees accountable for discriminatory behavior?
Because that really shows whether a company is truly committed to change.
It does.
Now, getting back to the legal side of things,
Yeah.
it's interesting that Jasmine Rand is focusing on what she calls discrimination in contract fulfillment, rather than just discrimination in public accommodation.
Interesting.
Sounds like kind of a technicality,
Yeah.
but I bet it's actually really important.
It is, by framing the lawsuits this way.
Okay.
She's targeting the core of how American Airlines operates its business.
Okay.
When you buy a plane ticket, you're entering into a contract with the airline, right?
Right.
That contract implies that the airline is going to provide you with certain services.
Yeah.
Like safe transportation, reasonable accommodations, and fair treatment.
Right.
And discrimination violates those terms.
So if the airline discriminates against a passenger based on their race, they're breaking that contract.
Exactly.
That's really smart.
It's a much stronger approach than just claiming discrimination in public accommodation.
Because it shows how discrimination actually hurts the airline's business.
It does, and it could lead to some serious financial consequences for them.
Right, like punitive damages.
Exact.
And they're not just facing potential financial losses.
Right.
Their reputation could be damaged too.
Absolutely.
Which in today's world is a huge deal.
They can be devastating for a company.
This is a wake-up call for the whole airline industry.
It is.
These lawsuits are a symptom of a much bigger problem.
Yeah.
And we can't just ignore them.
We need to use them as a starting point for a real conversation about race bias and the need for systemic change.
Well said. So far, we've outlined some specific cases of alleged racial profiling. We've pointed out this disturbing pattern of behavior and discussed the airline's kind of weak response. We've also started to unpack this complex concept of systemic racism and how it plays a role in all of this.
Right, and how it's not just about individual bad actors, but about the systems and structures that perpetuate these inequalities.
Exactly. And we've begun to explore the legal strategies that are being used to hold the airline accountable for its actions.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to talk about.
There is.
This deep dive has only just begun.
This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
We've definitely only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Where do we even start to tackle something as big as systemic racism?
Well, I think the key is to approach it with a good understanding of what's causing it.
Okay.
And a real commitment to finding solutions.
Okay, so we've talked about implicit bias, inadequate training, and the need for like a culture shift within the airline industry.
Right.
But what other factors are contributing to this problem?
One thing we haven't talked about yet is the power dynamic.
Okay.
Think about the whole context of air travel. You have passengers who are often stressed,
Right.
anxious,
Yeah.
maybe running late.
Totally.
And then you have airline employees who are responsible for keeping things in order and enforcing the rules and making sure everyone's safe.
So you're saying this power imbalance can actually make passengers more vulnerable?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially passengers from marginalized groups.
So they might be more likely to experience biased treatment.
Exactly. And when you combine that power imbalance with existing societal biases, it creates like a breeding ground for discrimination.
Right, because passengers of color might be seen as more threatening or less cooperative or more likely to cause trouble.
And all of this just because of their race.
Which is obviously not fair.
Not at all. And these perceptions, even if they're unconscious, can affect how airline employees treat them, leading to unfair treatment.
It's like they say justice is blind, but the people who administer it aren't.
That's a great way to put it.
We can have the best laws and policies in the world, but if the people enforcing them are operating with unconscious bias, those biases are going to show up in their actions.
It's inevitable.
Which brings us back to training.
Yes.
And not just any training, but like deep, meaningful training.
It's not about being nice to passengers.
Right.
It's about giving employees the tools and the knowledge to recognize and challenge their own biases.
So what does that kind of training look like?
Well, it needs to go beyond just defining discrimination.
Okay.
It has to really dive into implicit bias.
Okay.
Microaggressions.
Which are?
Those subtle but offensive comments or actions in the whole history of systemic racism.
So employees need to understand how their own unconscious biases can actually affect their actions.
Exactly. And they need strategies to deal with those biases when they're interacting with all passengers.
This sounds like a complete overhaul of how airlines approach diversity, equity, and inclusion.
It is. It can't just be like a checklist.
Right.
It has to be part of the company's DNA.
It needs to be a fundamental shift in how they think about these issues.
Yes, from a reactive approach to a proactive one.
So not just responding to incidents after they happen.
Right.
But actively trying to prevent them from happening in the first place.
Exactly. It's about making sure that everyone has an equitable and inclusive travel experience.
And that shift has to happen at every level of the company.
It does, from the CEO to the gate agent.
Right. Everyone needs to be on board with this.
Everyone. It's about creating a culture where discrimination isn't tolerated.
Yeah.
Where diversity is valued and where all passengers feel welcome and respected.
It's a big challenge.
It is.
But it's clear that things need to change.
They do.
These lawsuits against American Airlines are just one example of a much bigger problem. And we can't just sweep this under the rug.
We have to use this as an opportunity to have a real conversation. About race bias and the need for systemic change.
And it's not just the airline's responsibility to fix this, right?
You're absolutely right. Passengers have a role to play, too.
Okay, so what can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
Well, first of all, we can be more aware of what's going on around us
Okay.
and speak up if we see something that seems discriminatory.
Like if we see someone being treated unfairly.
Exactly. And you don't have to be confrontational about it.
Okay.
You could just ask a question, express concern, or offer support to the person who's being targeted.
Sometimes just acknowledging the situation can be enough to make a difference.
It can sometimes just showing that you're paying attention can deter further discrimination.
And if we feel comfortable,
Yeah,
we can report the incident to the airline.
absolutely.
Yeah.
A lot of airlines have ways to report discrimination.
Okay.
And while the response might not always be what you want,
Right.
it's important to document these incidents.
So that they can see the patterns.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
they can identify and address patterns of behavior.
And social media can be a powerful tool, too.
It can help to raise awareness and put pressure on airlines to take action.
But it's important to be mindful of privacy.
Of course.
And to make sure that what we're sharing is accurate and respectful.
Always.
Yeah.
But it can be a really effective way to amplify the voices of those who have been marginalized.
It's not just about calling out bad behavior, though.
No.
It's also about supporting the airlines that are actually trying to do the right thing.
Exactly. We can choose to fly with airlines that have a good track record on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right. And we can support organizations that are pushing for change within the airline industry.
Absolutely. Holding airlines accountable for their actions.
So we all have a role to play.
We do.
Yeah.
It's a collective effort.
To make the airline industry more just and equitable.
It's about moving from a culture of silence to a culture of awareness, accountability, and action.
And that requires us to be willing to have tough conversations,
It does.
to challenge our own biases, and to stand up for what's right.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
We're not just talking about inconvenience or discomfort here. We're
Right.
talking about fundamental human rights,
Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.
regardless of their race,
Absolutely. And that includes the right to travel freely and safely.
without fear of discrimination.
It shouldn't matter what color your skin is.
Right. Everyone should have equal access to opportunities
Yeah.
and experiences.
And air travel should be a welcoming experience for everyone.
Okay, so when we look at these specific lawsuits against American Airlines,
Yeah.
do we see any patterns?
We do. One really striking pattern is how random the accusations seem
Okay.
and how there's often no real evidence to support them.
Like, what do you mean?
In a lot of these cases, passengers were targeted based on really flimsy reasons.
Right.
Slamming a bathroom door.
Right.
Or just sitting next to someone of a different race.
So it seems like racial bias might be influencing people's perceptions, even when there's no actual threat,
Exactly. It's like people are seeing what they expect to see.
rather than what's actually happening.
Right. Their biases are coloring their interpretation of events.
So they're making assumptions based on race instead of on actual evidence.
And this really shows you how insidious implicit bias can be.
It's working in the background
It is. It's shaping our perceptions and our behavior.
without us even realizing it.
And because it's so subtle and often unintentional,
Yeah.
it can be really hard to address.
So how do you fight something that you don't even know is there?
Well, the first step is acknowledging that it exists
Okay.
and that we're all susceptible to it.
No one is immune to bias.
We all have these biases,
Oh.
whether we realize it or not.
And once we accept that,
Then we can start taking steps to mitigate the impact of those biases.
so it's all about self-awareness and being willing to look at our own beliefs and assumptions.
Right, and asking ourselves why we believe what we believe, and being open to the idea that our perspectives might be shaped by unconscious biases.
It sounds like that could be a pretty uncomfortable process.
It can be. It forces you to confront some hard truths about yourself.
But it's also really important.
It is the more we understand our own biases,
Yeah.
the better we can challenge them.
And prevent them from affecting how we treat others.
Exactly. And that's essential for creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely, both within the airline industry and in our everyday lives.
It reminds me of that Maya Angelou quote,
Oh, yeah.
"Do the best you can until you know better."
Then when you know better, do better.
Exactly.
It's all about learning and growing.
And creating lasting change.
Let's go back to Jasmine Rand's legal strategies for a minute. We were talking about how she's focusing on discrimination in contract fulfillment
Right.
instead of just discrimination in public accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. So when you buy a plane ticket,
Yeah.
you're entering into a contract with the airline.
Right.
That contract implies that the airline is going to provide you with certain services.
Like safe transportation, reasonable accommodations, things like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And discrimination
Yeah.
violates the terms of that contract.
So if the airline discriminates against a passenger based on their race,
They're breaking the contract.
and that can be grounds for legal action.
It can.
So that's why this strategy is so powerful.
It is, because it focuses on the airline's specific contractual obligations.
Right. Not just general anti-discrimination laws.
And it creates a more direct path to holding them accountable.
And if these lawsuits are successful, it could set a precedent for other airlines.
Absolutely. It could create a legal framework for challenging discrimination and encourage airlines to be more proactive in addressing racial bias.
So these cases could have far-reaching consequences.
They're not just about getting justice for these individuals.
Right. It's about systemic change.
Exactly. Change that benefits all passengers.
There's one piece of the puzzle we haven't talked about yet.
What's that?
The historical context.
Yes, that's important.
We can't forget that the airline industry has a long history
A very long history.
of racial segregation and discrimination.
It does. For a big chunk of the 20th century,
Yeah.
Black travelers faced all kinds of barriers to air travel.
Well, what kind of barriers?
Segregated seating,
Seriously.
discriminatory pricing, even being denied service altogether.
I had no idea it was that bad.
It's hard to believe now
It is.
that something as basic as traveling was denied to people
Just because of their race.
just because of the color of their skin.
And while that kind of overt segregation isn't legal anymore,
Right.
the legacy of that history, it's still affecting Black travelers today.
It is those historical traumas and the systemic inequalities
Yeah.
that were created by decades of segregation.
Yeah.
They didn't just disappear overnight.
They're still there under the surface.
They're shaping perceptions, influencing behavior, and perpetuating these disparities.
So even though explicit discrimination is illegal, there are still these remnants of the past that are contributing to the problem.
You can't erase history,
Right.
but you can learn from it.
So how does this historical context help us understand these lawsuits against American Airlines?
It helps us see that these aren't just isolated incidents.
Okay.
They're part of a much bigger pattern
Of racial bias.
of racial bias in the airline industry,
The fact that Black passengers are still being targeted for discriminatory treatment?
even in subtle ways,
Yeah.
suggests that we haven't fully dealt with the legacy of segregation.
We've made progress,
We have.
but there's still a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. We have to dismantle the structures of racism that are still embedded in our society.
It's not enough to just outlaw discrimination.
Nope. We have to actively work to dismantle the systems that create it.
And that requires understanding history and a commitment to equity.
And a willingness to challenge the way things are.
So how do we move beyond this history
Yeah.
and create a future for air travel that's truly just and inclusive?
Well, one important step is education.
Okay.
We need to teach people about the history of racial segregation in the airline industry and how it's still affecting people today.
And that education should start early
It should in schools in our communities.
so that future generations can learn from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. And education isn't just about learning the facts.
Right. It's about understanding the human impact.
It's about developing empathy, challenging our own biases, and creating a more just world.
But education alone isn't enough.
No, we also need concrete actions,
Like what kind of actions?
policy changes,
Okay.
to address the systemic issues.
Okay, so how do we hold airlines accountable for discriminatory practices?
Well, we need to enforce anti-discrimination laws, and we need proactive measures to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And that accountability can come from a lot of different places.
It can government agencies, advocacy groups, even passengers themselves.
So it's a team effort.
It is. Everyone needs to work together to push for change.
It's a complex issue
It is.
with a long history,
Mm-hmm.
but there are solutions.
There are.
We need education, accountability,
And a commitment to building a better future.
a future where air travel is just and inclusive for everyone.
Exactly. And that future is possible.
I like that.
It just takes us acknowledging the past, confronting the present, and working together to create a world where everyone can experience the freedom and joy of travel
Without fear of discrimination.
without fear of discrimination.
What a powerful thought, but what can airlines actually do
Yeah.
to address racial bias and create a travel experience that's truly inclusive for everyone?
One of the most important things is to have comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees,
Okay, so from the top down.
from the CEO all the way down to the gate agents.
And this training should go beyond just defining discrimination?
It needs to dig into implicit bias, microaggressions, and the impact of systemic racism.
So it's about giving employees the tools to recognize and challenge their own biases.
Exactly, and it's about helping them interact with all passengers in a fair and respectful way.
And this training needs to be ongoing.
It can't just be a one-time thing.
Right.
It needs to be embedded in the culture of the organization.
So it becomes part of the airline's everyday practices.
Exactly.
Training is key.
It is.
But it's not enough on its own.
No, we also need to see changes in policies and procedures.
To address these systemic issues.
Exactly. Airlines need to look at their hiring practices.
Okay.
Make sure they're equitable. They should be actively recruiting and promoting employees from diverse backgrounds.
And what about their customer service protocols?
They need to take a hard look at those too.
To make sure they're not discriminatory.
Right. And that they're not having a disproportionate impact on passengers of color.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. They could revise their policies for handling passenger complaints.
Okay.
They could provide more language support for passengers who don't speak English.
Right.
Or they could implement more equitable procedures for resolving ticketing issues.
So it's about looking at every aspect of the customer experience through this lens of equity and inclusion.
Exactly. And making changes to ensure that all passengers are treated fairly.
And respectfully.
It's not just about internal policies and procedures, though.
Okay, what else?
It's also about how airlines interact with the communities they serve.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, they could partner with community organizations to provide travel opportunities for underprivileged youth.
That's a great idea.
Or to support local businesses in diverse neighborhoods. Or to invest in initiatives that promote social justice and racial equity.
So it's about becoming a more active and engaged member of the community. Yeah. Exactly, not just a service provider.
Right. They need to use their influence for good.
And they need to be transparent about their efforts.
Transparency is key.
It is. Passengers need to see that airlines are taking these issues seriously.
Okay, so how can they do that?
They can publicly report on their diversity and inclusion metrics.
Okay.
They can share their progress on policy changes. And they can engage in open dialogue with their customers.
So it's about putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. It's about action, not just words.
And it's important to remember that creating a more just and inclusive airline industry is a journey.
It is not a destination.
Right. It takes constant learning and adapting.
And a willingness to be held accountable.
You've really emphasized the importance of working together on this.
We have to.
We all have a role to play.
We do.
In pushing for a more just and equitable world.
And that includes holding institutions like airlines accountable.
And there are lots of ways to do that.
There are.
We can choose to fly with airlines that have a good track record. We can speak up when we see discrimination.
Right.
And we can support organizations that are fighting for change.
So we can use our voices, our choices, and our resources.
To create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued when they travel. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together.
For a more just and equitable future.
Exactly.
We can't forget the impact discrimination has on individuals.
We can't imagine being accused of human trafficking.
Wow.
Just because of the color of your skin.
Yeah.
Especially on your honeymoon.
That's a horrible thought.
It is.
The psychological impact must be devastating.
It can lead to feelings of humiliation, anger, fear, distrust.
Yeah.
It can even trigger trauma responses.
And make it hard to feel safe traveling in the future.
Yeah.
It's not just the incident itself. It's the lingering effects.
Lasting impact.
It can make people question their sense of belonging, their self-worth, their safety in the world.
It can really shake you to your core.
So it's crucial to acknowledge that emotional impact.
It is. And provide support for those who have been affected.
Airlines have a responsibility to address that emotional harm.
And what can they do?
They can offer counseling services,
Right.
compensation for emotional distress, and take steps to restore the dignity of those who have been wronged.
And we have a responsibility as individuals, too.
We do. We need to be mindful of the impact of our words and actions.
Right. We can't perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
No.
Or dismiss the experiences of those who have been discriminated against.
You need empathy and compassion.
We need to listen to and believe those who share their experiences and offer support.
That's where allyship comes in.
Using our privilege to amplify the voices of those who've been marginalized.
And advocating for change.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the legal and ethical implications of racial profiling, the history of race in air travel,
Yeah.
The role of implicit bias, power dynamics, systemic racism.
Importance of education, accountability, and allyship. The challenges are real.
They are.
But there's also hope.
There is.
We've seen airlines taking steps to address these issues.
We have.
And we've seen the power of collective action.
We're not powerless in the face of injustice.
We can all make a difference.
We can.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm feeling hopeful, but also a sense of urgency.
I agree.
We can't let up.
But we have to keep pushing for progress.
Challenging the status quo.
And working towards a future.
Where air travel reflects our shared humanity.
A future where everyone can soar.
To our listeners,
Yeah.
we encourage you to keep learning about this topic.
Read more about these lawsuits.
Research the history of racial segregation in air travel.
And learn how you can help.
Create a more just and inclusive world.
This deep dive is just the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, it's so important that we don't forget about that emotional impact, you know?
Yeah.
We have to address the harm that discrimination causes.
Right. It's not just about policies and procedures.
Exactly. It's about people's lives. It's about recognizing the human cost of discrimination.
Think about it. You're on your honeymoon.
Yeah.
You're starting this new chapter in your life.
Right.
And you get accused of human trafficking.
Wow.
Just because of the color of your skin.
That's a horrifying thought.
It really is. And the psychological impact of that kind of experience,
Yeah.
it can be devastating.
It can be really traumatic.
It can lead to feelings of humiliation, anger,
Yeah.
fear, distrust.
And it can make it hard to travel in the future?
Absolutely. People might start to feel anxious or scared.
Right. Like they're always being watched or judged.
Exactly. And it's not just the incident itself.
Yeah, right.
It's the lingering effects.
The way it stays with you.
Yeah. It can make people question their sense of belonging,
Their self-worth.
their safety in the world.
It can really shake your whole foundation.
Discrimination can chip away at a person's self-esteem.
Make it hard to trust others.
And they can create this sense of hypervigilance.
Where you're constantly on edge.
Like you're always expecting something bad to happen.
So we have to acknowledge that emotional impact.
We do.
And provide support for those who have been affected.
Absolutely. And airlines need to take responsibility for that.
Okay, so what can they do?
They can offer counseling services,
Okay.
compensation for emotional distress, and take steps to restore the dignity of those who've been wronged.
It's about going beyond a simple apology.
It is. It's about showing genuine care and concern.
And we have a responsibility as individuals, too.
We do. We need to be more aware of our words and actions.
Right, and we can't just stand by and do nothing.
We have to speak up when we see something wrong,
We have to be allies.
using our privilege to support those who are marginalized.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've talked about the legal and ethical implications of racial profiling,
The historical context, the role of implicit bias,
power dynamics, systemic racism.
the importance of education, accountability, and allyship,
We've seen how deeply ingrained these problems are.
and how they affect real people's lives.
But we've also seen that there's hope.
There is,
We've seen that change is possible.
and that we all have a role to play in making that change happen.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah,
I'm feeling a mix of emotions.
That's it.
There's a sense of urgency.
definitely.
We can't afford to be complacent.
We have to keep pushing for progress.
But there's also a sense of hope,
There is hope because we've seen that people are starting to pay attention.
and they're starting to demand better.
And that's how change happens.
So to our listeners,
Yeah.
we encourage you to keep learning about this issue.
Keep the conversation going.
Read more about these lawsuits against American Airlines.
Learn about the history of racial segregation in air travel.
And find ways to get involved.
Because we can create a better future.
A future where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued when they travel.
A future where air travel reflects our shared humanity.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world.